A racist passenger publicly derides a black mother and her child in an ordinary economy row, expecting laughter and ease. The mother answers with calm dignity and a small symbolic gesture that shifts the cabin's energy. A composed man enters the frame, his presence suggesting a title that might change everything. The chapter ends on tense eye contact, hinting a reveal to come. "We don't sit next to people like you." The jab struck the cabin and scattered the easy hum of conversation. Heads turned. A woman with a travel pillow paused. A man tugged at his tie. Sunlight made a band across the oval window, lighting ordinary faces into witnesses. Row 14 was not first class, just a sprawl of travelers between wings, strollers, and coffee cups. That made the insult sharper. Not thrown among elites, but hurled into common air, where strangers silently share the rules of civility. The voice belonged to a man who wore entitlement like linen. Crisp, presumed, never questioned. He laughed before he spoke, a brittle sound, then pointed openly at the black woman settling into 14C, her little daughter beside her with a thin paperback. "What's she doing here?" he said loud enough for the aisle to catch. "Did she get this seat from a giveaway?" Laughter leaked from his companion, small and hungry. Phones tilted, the reflex of a moment turned into content. The mother did not flinch. Her hands were steady as she placed a backpack under the seat and smoothed the scarf around her throat. Her silence was a choice. She had carried it before, like a shield that made quick anger unnecessary. Around them, the cabin's temperature shifted. A businessman closed his laptop with a soft click. A student lowered his earbuds. The flight attendant paused with a cart between rows, brow knitting, waiting for someone to own the moment. The man's grin widened. He leaned back, sure of the sound his words had made. "You sure you belong here?" he added, savoring the sting. His voice rode a small triumph. The mother's daughter traced the margin of her book, unaware of the social calculus unfolding. The mother folded the corner of the paperback, a tiny, deliberate gesture. It was symbolic, an unspoken assertion that she would not let a stranger's contempt rewrite her day. She met the man's gaze with a quiet that did not plead. The softness in her face was not weakness. It was a calm that had been trained by experience. "You always think the world's a stage for your jokes," she said, voice even. The cabin leaned in without knowing it. Her words landed not as plea, but as a quiet mirror. The man's laughter faltered. He expected the echo of his own cruelty. Instead, he found a stillness that refracted his mockery. He scoffed, louder now to cover the odd emptiness in his victory. "Maybe she got it from a discount flyer," he sneered. "Maybe she's lost." She reached under the seat, not for a retort but for a small card she drew out carefully. Thin, embossed, the kind of thing that catches light in readable letters. She held it low, not shouting, only lifting the edge so those closest could see the glint of authority. Her motion was precise, a symbolic counter. "I understand more than enough," she said softly. "I know who I am where others try to name me." The tone shifted the room. There was no spectacle, only a rearrangement of attention. A woman in the back set down her knitting. A teenage boy stopped recording and simply watched. The man's face, set in smug lines, tightened. He had assumed silence, assumed collapse. He had not accounted for the space inside someone who kept their dignity as carefully as a small child held a toy. His bravado wavered. At that instant, a new presence entered the frame. Someone who did not shout, but whose entrance changed the geometry of the aisle. He moved with the easy certainty of a man used to rooms bending around him. Not showy, not bulky, just composed, the kind of posture that suggests a title without stating it. He paused beside the woman in 14C, offering nothing but a mild lift of his chin. "Sir," he said, tone measured, "mind your manners." The words themselves were simple, but his voice carried a weight that made the man's edge dull. The cabin absorbed the exchange. Phones still glowed, but now their recording felt like a witness to a turning. The man who had laughed found his jokes returning to him like dull coins. He opened his mouth and closed it again, throat dry for the first time. The woman in 14C did not smile triumphantly. She had no need. Her hand rested briefly on her daughter's shoulder. A mother's compass. And then she folded the card away, as if it belonged in a pocket where its power could rest quietly. The man who had mocked her flicked his eyes toward the new figure and then past him, curiosity and unease colliding. For a heartbeat, the cabin existed in a held balance. Small cruelty on one side, the quiet accumulation of reputation on the other. Outside, the sun dipped, and the plane hummed toward its route. Inside, something else navigated. The margin where arrogance collides with consequence. A steward's practiced neutrality thinned into interest. The woman in row 19 set down her coffee. The air shifted in subtle increments that did not roar, but changed trajectories. Notifications bloomed as devices pinged. A single clip would travel fast. Yet the change in the aisle was more than a viral fragment. It was the particular gravity of someone who could, with one quiet presence, tilt a conversation from mockery to accountability. The man who had laughed now felt a small, unfamiliar thing. Doubt. He scanned the faces. A tired commuter. A mother with a stroller. A student who had been filming but now watched. The cabin's patience shifted. It was not a roar, but a quiet tightening. A collective refusal to bless contempt. Even the attendant, trained to smooth every minor storm, watched with a crease between her brows. The mocker shifted in his seat, suddenly aware that his joke had not landed as triumph, but as an exposure. He had misread the room, and the room was refusing him. The chapter closes on a shard of eye contact, between the man who had laughed and the man who had introduced a different gravity. The rest of the flight held its breath, watching which identity would speak next. The small, habitual king of the aisle, or the measured presence whose title, when revealed, might redraw the lines of consequence. The airplane seemed to shrink, not physically, but in the way the air compressed, pulling everyone closer into a single moment that no one could escape. The engines hummed steady. The lights glowed soft above. Yet every sound felt sharper. The rattle of ice in a plastic cup, the squeak of a reclining chair, the nervous cough from the man 2 rows back. The racist passenger straightened his shoulders, refusing to let the silence drown him. His pride, punctured for a brief moment, demanded repair. He chuckled loudly, forcing the sound into the cabin like a bad tune. "Relax, folks," he announced, voice dripping with smugness. "It's just a joke. Can't you all take a joke?" Nobody laughed. Not a single chuckle came back to him. Instead, there was the faint buzz of phones, screens glowing in evidence. He shifted in his seat, cheeks coloring with the heat of his own isolation. His eyes darted toward the black woman. She sat still, her scarf neat, her daughter's small hand resting on her lap. The girl looked up at her mother, puzzled, but the mother simply smoothed the girl's braids gently. A wordless reassurance. It was an act so quiet, so maternal, that it stood in direct contrast to the man's bluster. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" The man snapped suddenly, pointing a finger across the aisle. His voice was sharp, ugly, desperate for a reaction. "Sitting there all high and mighty like you own the place." The irony twisted through the air, invisible but palpable. Passengers exchanged glances. A woman 2 rows up pressed her lips tight. The businessman with the laptop leaned back, his arms folded, silently studying the drama. The mysterious man, who had spoken only once, remained standing in the aisle, his gaze locked on the instigator. His presence radiated a quiet weight, not confrontational, not theatrical, but undeniable. It was the kind of presence that turned arrogance into a shadow of itself. "Sir," he said again, his voice low, controlled, but heavy with restrained authority. Enough, the passenger barked a laugh. And who are you? Her bodyguard? What? She bring a babysitter for economy class? He sneered, pleased with his own cruelty. The mysterious man didn't respond right away. He adjusted his cuff calmly, his silence deliberate. That silence stung more than any insult could, as if words weren't even necessary for him to command attention. The racist man shifted in his seat, the edges of doubt creeping back into his performance. The flight attendant, torn between her training and the raw tension before her, finally stepped forward. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice firm but not loud. "I need this to stop. Now. You're disturbing the passengers." The racist man's eyes flicked to her, then back at the black woman. "Disturbing?" he said, forcing out another laugh. "I'm the one disturbed here, having to sit next to her. I paid good money for this seat, and I'm not moving." The words dropped like stones. A ripple of discomfort spread down the aisle. Some passengers shook their heads. One older woman whispered, "Unbelievable." A teenager angled his phone higher, recording every second. The black woman still hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't fired back with anger. Instead, she leaned close to her daughter and whispered something only the child could hear. The girl's face softened, her small shoulders relaxing. It was strength disguised as tenderness. An answer sharper than rage. "You embarrass yourself," the mysterious man finally said. His words were precise, clean, and steady. "And you don't even realize it." The racist passenger flushed, caught between fury and fear. "Who do you think you are to talk to me like that?" he snapped, his voice cracking at the edges. The man gave no title, no name. He simply stood, meeting the gaze of the entire cabin. And in that moment, he didn't need to explain himself. Everyone felt it. The undercurrent of power. The sense that this man was not just another traveler, but someone whose word carried weight far beyond row 14. The racist passenger shifted, his certainty fraying. He glanced at the phones recording him, at the passengers staring without sympathy, at the child leaning against her mother's arm with quiet trust. His joke, once his shield, now hung around his neck like a chain. "Sit down," he muttered finally, his bravado weakening. "You don't scare me." But his eyes betrayed him. They flicked nervously to the man's steady face, to the calm that unsettled him more than any raised voice ever could. The engines roared slightly louder as the plane gained altitude, and the moment stretched taut, like fabric pulled to its breaking point. The racist passenger clung to his pride, desperate to keep the upper hand, but the cabin itself had shifted. The balance of power no longer belonged to him. The black woman finally spoke, her voice quiet but sharp as glass. "Your seat doesn't define your worth," she said. "But your words just defined yours." Gasps flickered through the rows. Some passengers nodded subtly, others held their breath. The racist passenger had no comeback. For the first time, his laughter failed him. The mysterious man glanced at the mother, a faint nod passing between them, a silent promise that this moment was not the end, but the beginning of something greater. And as the flight carried them higher, the question hung in the cabin like unspoken thunder. When the world learned who this man truly was, what would it mean for the one who had mocked so freely? The seatbelt sign blinked off with a soft chime, but the tension remained strapped across the cabin like a second harness. The aircraft steadied at 30,000 feet, slicing through the clouds with a hum that should have lulled the passengers into sleep or daydreams. Instead, the atmosphere was alive with whispers. "They got it on video, right?" murmured a woman in row 16, leaning toward her husband. "Of course they did," he whispered back. "It'll be online before we land." The racist passenger shifted in his seat, pretending not to hear, but every murmur crawled under his skin. He tugged at his collar, the smug grin returning in pieces, stitched together from habit rather than confidence. He took a sip of his drink too quickly, spilling a drop on his shirt. The stain bloomed across the fabric like a badge of his unraveling. Across the aisle, the black woman adjusted her daughter's blanket. The little girl rested her head on her mother's shoulder, eyes half closed, the chaos around her fading into the comfort of that steady presence. The mother hummed softly under her breath, not a song anyone recognized, but enough to carve a small sanctuary within the storm. Passengers kept stealing glances. Some looked at the mother with admiration, others at the racist man with barely veiled contempt. The teenager who had been filming replayed the clip, the glow of his phone lighting up his smirk. He nudged his friend. "This is going viral," he whispered. "He's finished." The racist passenger caught the words and snapped his head around. "Delete that!" he barked. His voice cracked, and his command carried no authority. The boy raised his eyebrows and shook his head slowly, deliberately, refusing. The man's mouth opened, then closed again. "You're embarrassing yourself," someone muttered from the back. It wasn't loud, but it was enough. A ripple of agreement moved quietly from row to row, like a tide he couldn't control. The mysterious man remained standing in the aisle, though the attendants had subtly tried to guide him back to his seat. He ignored the suggestions with polite nods, as though gravity itself allowed him to remain where he chose. His gaze stayed steady, fixed not on the racist man, but on the larger picture unfolding around them. Finally, the racist passenger turned on him again. "Why are you still here?" he demanded, his voice too loud for the calm cabin. "You think you're some kind of authority? You think you're better than me?" The man tilted his head slightly, considering the question. Then he said, "Better? No, but different, yes." The simplicity of the word struck harder than any boast could. Passengers leaned in, sensing the weight beneath the calm. The racist passenger scoffed, but it came out hollow. He tried again, louder. "You don't scare me. You're just another guy in a suit." "Nothing special." The mysterious man said nothing. Instead, he slowly returned to his seat beside the woman, his movements deliberate, unhurried. He fastened his belt with a quiet click, his eyes never leaving the man across the aisle. The silence of the gesture carried its own authority, more commanding than raised voices. The black woman glanced at him briefly, as though she already knew what others did not. Her lips pressed together in the faintest smile, subtle, almost hidden. But it was there. The racist man drummed his fingers against the armrest, searching for control he no longer had. "I paid for comfort," he muttered, but no one answered. His words evaporated into the recycled air, leaving him alone with his performance. The whispers around the cabin thickened. "Who do you think that man is?" a woman asked softly. "Some kind of lawyer?" another guessed. "Not just a lawyer," someone else replied. "Did you see the way the attendant looked at him? Like she recognized something." Speculation spread like fire in dry grass. The man at the center of it all remained silent, his presence speaking louder than rumors. The black woman shifted slightly, pulling out her daughter's coloring book. She handed her a crayon, her actions practical and grounding. It was a quiet defiance, a way of reclaiming the ordinary in the midst of spectacle. The crayons clicked softly against the tray table as the child began to draw, oblivious to the eyes darting between her and her mother. The racist man couldn't stand it. The ease, the poise, the complete absence of collapse. He leaned forward, sneering. "You act like you belong here, but you don't fool me. People like you never belong." This time, the black woman looked him in the eye. Her voice was calm, steady, but edged with truth. "People like me built the very roads you drive on. We fly in the planes you take for granted. We raise the children who grow into the doctors who will one day save your life. Tell me again that we don't belong." The cabin froze. Her words sliced cleanly, undeniable and heavy. No one moved. Even the engines seemed to quiet for a moment. The racist man opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He looked around desperately for support, but found only the cool, silent stares of strangers who no longer found him amusing. His laughter, his shield, had abandoned him. The mysterious man leaned back in his seat, one hand resting lightly on the armrest, as though the outcome had already been decided. He said nothing, but his silence was louder than applause. The whispers grew again, this time different, admiring, supportive. Some passengers smiled at the mother, others nodded in respect. The racist man shrank into his seat, smaller than he had been at takeoff. High above the clouds, dignity had redrawn the map of the cabin. And though no one yet knew the man's true title, the atmosphere hinted that when revealed, it would end the charade completely. The hum of the engines became background music to something more pressing, the sound of a man cracking under the weight of his own arrogance. The racist passenger sat rigid, jaw tight, eyes darting from face to face like a cornered animal seeking escape. The smirk he had worn at boarding was gone, replaced by something brittle, like porcelain beginning to fracture. A flight attendant approached, her tray balanced with drinks. "Sir, would you like something else?" she asked politely, her tone neutral but distant. It was the kind of professional courtesy that sounded like obligation, not choice. He forced a smile. "Whiskey, double." Her eyebrows twitched ever so slightly, but she nodded and poured. The liquid splashed against the glass with a muted defiance. She set it down with precision, careful not to touch him. He grabbed it too quickly, the ice clinking as his hand trembled. Across the aisle, the black woman sipped her water calmly. Her daughter leaned into her side, coloring quietly, the crayon moving in deliberate strokes. The simple picture, her child safe, her presence steady, burned in contrast to the man's restless fumbling. Passengers noticed. They always noticed. The mother's dignity had become an anchor, grounding the cabin. The man's arrogance had become a storm, unpredictable and exhausting. "Hey," he muttered suddenly, leaning across the aisle toward the mysterious man. "You think you've won something? You think all these people respect you?" His voice wavered, desperate for dominance. The man didn't look at him. He calmly flipped a page of the in-flight magazine, as though reading about exotic destinations was more interesting than the rant unraveling beside him. That silence was a weapon. The racist man felt it, his cheeks flushed, red climbing into his ears. He turned to the passengers nearest him. "You all think you know me. You don't. I've worked hard for everything I have. People like me built this country." A passenger 2 rows back leaned forward. His voice was quiet, but cutting. "Funny. That's exactly what she just said." Laughter rippled. Not cruel, but sharp enough to sting. The man's face twisted. He slammed his drink onto the tray table, liquid spilling over the rim. "This is harassment!" he barked. "No," said a voice from the back. Calm, firm. "This is accountability." He froze, scanning the rows. The faces staring back no longer feared him, no longer tolerated him. Some recorded openly now, phones raised without hesitation. The judgment wasn't loud, but it was everywhere. The black woman finally spoke, her tone low and unwavering. "You're fighting the wrong enemy." His head whipped toward her. "What's that supposed to mean?" She didn't flinch. "It means you're wasting your energy trying to belittle strangers on a plane. The enemy you're fighting is inside you, and you're losing." For a moment, silence swallowed the cabin whole. Her words floated, heavy, undeniable. Even the flight attendants paused mid-step, absorbing the truth. The man laughed, but it was hollow, broken. "You people always play the victim," he sneered, though his voice cracked. "Always acting like the world is against you." The mysterious man finally looked up. His eyes met the racist passengers with a calm that was unnerving, almost surgical. "Not acting," he said softly. "Surviving." The word hung in the air. Surviving. It echoed in the ears of every passenger, threading through their memories of headlines, protests, and injustices they had scrolled past on their screens. Here it was, alive, undeniable, sitting across the aisle. The racist passenger leaned back, gripping the armrests as though they might steady him. His confidence was unraveling strand by strand. Every attempt to reassert power slipped through his fingers. The harder he tried, the smaller he appeared. A little girl from another row leaned out, her innocent voice carrying across the cabin. "Mommy, why is that man so mean?" The question pierced deeper than any adult accusation could. The mother hushed her daughter, but the words were already lodged in the man's chest. He blinked, stunned, as though for the first time he saw himself through unfiltered eyes. Passengers exchanged looks. The story unfolding had shifted. This was no longer the performance of a bully. It was the exposure of fragility. The black woman brushed her daughter's curls gently, whispering something soft only she could hear. It was a small act of love, louder than any argument. The mysterious man closed the magazine, folding it neatly and placing it on the seat pocket. He leaned forward slightly, his voice measured. "Masks always break at altitude. The air is too thin for lies." The racist man's lips parted, but he had no reply. His glass sat half empty on the tray, melting ice diluting what little strength he thought he'd found. The cabin had shifted. He wasn't the center anymore. He was background noise to a greater truth. And though he still clung to fragments of his arrogance, the cracks were showing, wide enough for everyone to see. The engines droned on, steady and unbothered, while inside the cabin a very different kind of turbulence brewed. It wasn't the kind measured by altitude or weather patterns. It was the kind measured by dignity, by the invisible weight of collective judgment. The racist passenger shifted in his seat, tugging at his collar as though the air had thickened. No one had spoken to him in several minutes, yet he felt suffocated by the silence. It was not emptiness. It was a verdict, heavy and undeniable. He drummed his fingers against the tray table. "You're all just waiting for me to say something wrong, aren't you?" His voice was too loud, breaking the hush that had settled over the rows. No one answered. The black woman smoothed her daughter's hair, her hands steady, her expression calm. The little girl hummed softly, tracing patterns on the fogged window. The image was too ordinary, too peaceful, and that ordinary peace mocked the chaos brewing inside him. A man in the row ahead shifted slightly, tilting his head as though making a mental note. The subtle action felt louder than a shout. Cameras still hovered in discreet hands, their tiny red recording lights glowing like watchful eyes. The passenger's throat tightened. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "I didn't do anything wrong." "You're twisting it. You're all twisting it." A flight attendant passed by, her cart rattling. She avoided his eyes deliberately, the same way one avoids a spill in the aisle. Something messy but temporary. The indifference stung more than confrontation. He slammed a fist lightly against the armrest. "Say something!" His voice cracked with desperation. "If you think I'm wrong, tell me." Still, no one responded. The silence had teeth. It chewed at him, tore at the fragile remnants of his pride. He was used to winning arguments with volume, with force, with sheer insistence, but now his voice only echoed back against the wall of quiet, smaller each time. Across the aisle, the mysterious man finally moved. He reached for his water, unscrewed the cap, and took a slow drink. The motion was unhurried, deliberate, as though he had all the time in the world. When he set the bottle down, he looked at the racist passenger with eyes as calm as a still lake. "Sometimes silence is the loudest thing in the room," he said softly. The words slid into the cabin like a knife. Passengers breathed it in, some nodding imperceptibly. The racist man flinched as though struck. He shook his head violently. No, that's not what's happening. You're all conspiring against me." "That's what this is." The black woman turned to him for the first time in minutes. Her gaze was direct, unwavering. "No one has to conspire against you. You're doing it to yourself." The simplicity of the statement made his chest tighten. He wanted to argue, but his words tangled before reaching his mouth. He opened his lips, then closed them, choking on his own unfinished defense. The little girl beside her mother looked up, her voice small but piercing. "Mommy, why doesn't he like us?" Her mother smiled softly at her, stroking her cheek. "Some people forget that kindness is free." The racist passenger blinked, stunned by the innocence of the exchange. Every argument he had prepared, every justification, suddenly felt childish, flimsy. He reached for his glass again, but his hand shook so much the ice rattled like distant thunder. The silence grew heavier. It wasn't empty. It was full, full of judgment, full of memory, full of centuries that whispered through the calm eyes of a mother who refused to be moved. He leaned back, his head pressing into the seat. He stared at the overhead lights, blinking rapidly as though they blurred his vision. "This isn't fair," he whispered. The mysterious man leaned in slightly, his voice just loud enough to reach him. "Fairness is what you never gave. Now it's staring back at you." The racist man clenched his jaw, but no words came. The silence had won. It wrapped around him like chains, each breath heavier than the last. For the rest of the flight, no one looked directly at him. No one spoke his name, and yet he felt more exposed than if the entire cabin had shouted at once. The silence was not absence. It was judgment incarnate, and it was breaking him, piece by fragile piece. The cabin lights dimmed as the crew prepared for meal service, but the tension that hung in the air was brighter, sharper than any overhead bulb. The racist passenger sat stiffly, his shirt damp with sweat despite the cool air. His fingers tapped nervously on the armrest, a rhythm out of sync with the hum of the engines. He wanted to say something, to reclaim the control he felt slipping through his hands, but every word felt dangerous now. The silence of the passengers pressed down on him, their eyes heavy even when they pretended not to look. Finally, he blurted out, "You all don't even know who I am." His voice cracked halfway through the sentence, desperation wrapped in bravado. Several heads turned. The mysterious man across the aisle leaned back in his seat, folding his arms with the kind of ease that comes from knowing he doesn't have to prove anything. The racist man tried to laugh, but it came out hollow. "I've got connections, real power. I don't have to sit here and listen to this circus." The black woman's eyes met his, calm but piercing. "Power doesn't protect you from truth." Her words struck deeper than she intended, slicing through his thin armor. He clenched his fists, his knuckles white. "Truth? What do you know about truth? You people—" He stopped, realizing too late that the words he was about to say would brand him beyond repair. Gasps echoed from nearby rows. The unfinished insult hung in the air like smoke after a firework, poisonous even in fragments. The little girl beside the black woman tilted her head, confusion clouding her innocent eyes. "Mommy, why is he so angry?" Her mother smiled faintly, brushing the girl's cheek. "Because anger is the only thing he has left." The cabin seemed to shift. The balance of power had turned completely. The racist man's voice no longer carried weight. It trembled like an old radio signal, full of static and desperation. One passenger, a middle-aged woman in business attire, spoke for the first time. "You know, we all heard you earlier. Every word. You don't get to erase that just because you're uncomfortable now." Her tone was firm, professional, the kind of voice used in boardrooms where decisions are final. The racist passenger flinched, as though realizing he was on trial in a court he didn't control. The mysterious man leaned forward slightly, his voice low but commanding. "Masks can only last so long. Altitude has a way of stripping them off." The racist man shook his head violently, as if trying to shake off the words themselves. No, you're twisting everything. I'm not the villain here. But his excuses collapsed under the weight of his own history. Every justification sounded thinner, weaker, and with each failed attempt to reclaim authority, the mask slipped further, revealing fear beneath the arrogance. The black woman's calm gaze never wavered. She wasn't attacking him. She didn't need to. Her very presence was the challenge. Her quiet dignity, an indictment of everything he pretended to be. Another passenger whispered, not quietly enough, "He's unraveling." The words struck like a gavel. The racist man's chest heaved, as though he were drowning in the very air he had once dominated. He pressed his palms to his face, his voice muffled. "This isn't who I am. This isn't—" But no one rushed to reassure him. No one offered comfort. The silence spoke louder than pity ever could. The mysterious man's voice cut through again, smooth and precise. Sometimes the unmasking isn't about who people think you are. It's about who you've been all along. The racist man lowered his hands, eyes bloodshot, face pale. He looked smaller now, as though the seat had swallowed him whole. For the first time since boarding, he seemed human. Not larger than life, not untouchable. Just a man, stripped of illusion, and in that raw exposure, his unraveling was complete. The glow of phone screens lit the cabin like stars in a midnight sky. Cameras tilted, lenses fixed, fingers steady. Every second was being captured, archived, transformed into evidence. The racist passenger's voice, once booming with arrogant certainty, now sounded like an echo in a hollow chamber. He tried to straighten his posture, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You can record all you want. None of this matters. People like me, people with status, we don't lose." But even as he spoke, the conviction was gone. His words fell flat, bouncing off the passenger's silence. The black woman reached for a napkin, dabbing gently at her daughter's cheek where a small drop of juice had spilled. The gesture was ordinary, maternal, but in that ordinariness was power. She wasn't flustered, wasn't rattled. She was present, grounded, the anchor in a storm that wasn't hers to begin with. Her calmness infuriated him. "Stop acting like you're above this," he spat suddenly. "You're just pretending. People like you always pretend." The mysterious man finally spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "She doesn't have to pretend. That's the difference." The words cut sharper than any insult. The racist passenger's jaw tightened. He looked around, desperate for an ally, but found none. Eyes that once looked past him now pinned him in place, unblinking. A young man 2 rows back lowered his phone just enough to speak. "You do realize this is already online, right? Livestream. Thousands watching." The racist passenger froze. His hands trembled as he glanced at the glowing screens surrounding him. He was no longer just a man on a plane. He was content, a headline waiting to be written, a downfall unfolding in real time. His voice faltered. You can't, you don't have the right to—" "Rights?" the black woman interrupted softly. She didn't raise her voice, yet the entire cabin heard her. "That's the word you never thought we had. That's the word you trample until it suits you." Her daughter looked up at her, eyes wide, sensing the gravity even if she couldn't fully understand it. The little girl reached for her mother's hand, squeezing tightly. The racist passenger tried to laugh, but it came out broken, like glass shattering. "You think one video changes anything? People like me, we survive scandals." But the mysterious man leaned forward, eyes fixed on him with calm authority. "Scandals are storms. This isn't a storm. This is the truth. And truth doesn't fade, it spreads." A ripple of murmurs spread through the cabin. Several passengers nodded, whispering agreement. The racist man's breathing quickened, shallow and erratic. His tie suddenly felt like a noose, his collar suffocating. He yanked at it, sweat dampening the fabric. He reached for his drink, but his hand shook so violently that the liquid sloshed onto his lap. Gasps and muffled laughter rose around him. The stain spread across his pants like ink bleeding through paper, a visible mark of humiliation. He slammed the cup down, his voice rising in panic. "This is harassment! I'll sue every single one of you!" But no one flinched. No one believed him. The black woman leaned slightly forward, her eyes unblinking. The law you cling to doesn't protect cruelty. It never has. Her husband's silence was just as loud. He simply adjusted his cufflinks, the subtle glint of gold catching the cabin light. A detail small to some, but unmistakable to those who noticed. His presence carried weight, a quiet authority that required no announcement. The racist man caught the glint, his eyes narrowing. For the first time, uncertainty crept into his expression. Who are you?" he asked, his voice trembling, but the mysterious man didn't answer. Not yet. Instead, he leaned back, letting the question hang in the air like a shadow waiting for dawn. Passengers leaned forward in anticipation. Phones zoomed in. The story wasn't just about a racist man unraveling. It was about the moment before revelation, the sharp inhale before the truth would strike. The racist passenger shifted uncomfortably, his mask slipping further with each passing second. He knew, everyone knew, that reputations weren't built in silence. They collapsed in it, and his was already in freefall. The engines hummed their steady song, but inside the cabin, every heartbeat felt louder. The racist passenger's face was pale, his bravado leaking away with each breath. He leaned forward, eyes darting toward the man who sat across the aisle, the one who had said so little but commanded so much. "Who are you?" His voice cracked, a mix of demand and plea. "Tell me." The cabin hushed instantly. Even children stilled, sensing the gravity of the moment. Phones tilted higher, capturing every angle, every breath, every twitch. The black woman rested her hand lightly on her daughter's shoulder, her calm presence radiating strength. She didn't need to answer. She simply turned her gaze toward her husband, giving him the floor without words. The mysterious man straightened slowly, his movements deliberate, controlled. He adjusted his jacket, smoothed the crease on his trousers, and lifted his chin just enough to command attention. His eyes locked onto the racist passenger's trembling ones. "You want to know who I am?" His voice was deep, steady, resonant. "I'm the man who signs the checks for this airline." Gasps erupted across the rows. Passengers exchanged shocked glances, mouths open, phones shaking as they recorded. The racist passenger blinked rapidly, disbelief warring with humiliation. What do you mean?" The man's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. "I own it. The very plane you're sitting on, the crew you've insulted, the company you assume you're above, I bought it. My family runs it, and you've been disrespecting my wife on our airline." The silence that followed was electric, like the air before lightning strikes. The weight of the revelation settled heavily over the cabin, undeniable and immovable. The racist passenger's jaw dropped. He scrambled for words, any words, but all that came out was a stammer. You're lying! You can't! People like you don't—" But the man leaned closer, his eyes sharp enough to cut. "People like me say it. Finish your sentence." The passenger swallowed hard. His throat tightened, the words choking before they left his mouth. For the first time, he looked small, insignificant, cornered not by insults, but by truth. A flight attendant, who had stood silently nearby, spoke with sudden respect. "Sir," she said, addressing the black man with a slight bow of her head. "Would you like us to intervene?" He shook his head slowly, calm as ever. "No, he's already defeated himself." The black woman squeezed her daughter's hand gently, her expression serene. She didn't gloat, didn't smirk. Her dignity remained intact, untouched by his chaos. Her silence was her victory. The racist passenger's voice trembled. This can't be real. If you're who you say you are, then why sit here? Why not?" "Because power doesn't need a stage," the man interrupted smoothly. "It reveals itself when arrogance tries to disguise ignorance." Passengers erupted into murmurs. Someone whispered, "This is going viral in minutes." Another muttered, "I can't believe we're witnessing this." The racist man slumped into his seat, his body folding in on itself. His eyes darted from face to face, searching for sympathy, but all he found was indifference, or worse, quiet condemnation. The black woman leaned forward just enough to speak, her voice low but clear. "Now do you understand? Dignity doesn't bow to arrogance. Not in the air. Not anywhere." The racist man's lips trembled. His mask was gone, his authority shattered. What remained was only the raw, unvarnished truth of a man stripped of all illusions, and the cabin knew it. They had witnessed the reveal, the turning point, the moment arrogance met its end. The racist passenger sat frozen, his knuckles white against the armrest, his chest heaving with shallow breaths. The revelation still echoed in the air. The airline belonged to the very man he mocked. It wasn't just defeat. It was public collapse, witnessed and recorded by dozens of unblinking lenses. The murmurs around him grew louder, filling the cabin like waves crashing against a shore. "Did you hear that? He owns the airline? Unbelievable! That guy just destroyed himself." The passenger squeezed his eyes shut, wishing the voices away, wishing the moment undone. But reality was relentless. Every whisper carved into his pride, each glance felt like a dagger. He tried to straighten his posture, to reclaim a shred of control, but his shoulders sagged, betraying him. The black man remained calm, almost unnervingly so. He didn't gloat. He didn't raise his voice. He simply sat there, hands resting on his knees, presence radiating quiet authority. It was a silence that screamed louder than any insult could. The woman across from him adjusted her daughter's blanket, her movements gentle, maternal. Her face carried neither triumph nor bitterness, only the serene assurance of someone who had long known her worth. The dignity in her stillness made the man's humiliation more unbearable. The racist passenger couldn't hold back anymore. He leaned forward, his voice desperate. "I didn't mean it like that. I was joking. Just a joke, you know?" The man didn't even blink. His eyes stayed locked, steady, unyielding. "No, you meant every word. Jokes don't crawl out of the mouth unless they're fed by the heart." The passenger flinched. His lips quivered, but no defense came. The truth had cornered him, stripped him bare. Around them, passengers shook their heads. Some turned away, disgusted. Others stared, their expressions carved with judgment. And some, quietly recording, knew the collapse they were capturing would ripple far beyond this plane. The flight attendant approached carefully, holding a tray of water bottles. She glanced at the black man, awaiting silent approval. He nodded once. She turned and placed a bottle gently in front of the trembling passenger. "You look like you need this," she said softly, her tone edged with pity rather than respect. He grabbed it with shaky fingers, fumbling with the cap, but when he finally took a sip, the water did nothing to wash away the bitter taste of shame. The black woman leaned slightly forward, her eyes calm but piercing. "You laughed at me when I sat down. You thought my presence diminished yours. Tell me, how does it feel now, to know it was your laughter that exposed your weakness?" Her words landed like stones dropped into a still lake, rippling through every ear in the cabin. The passenger's face reddened, his lips parted, but no sound came. The man's daughter, who had been quietly watching, tilted her head. Her innocent voice broke the tension. "Mommy, why is he so mean?" The question pierced deeper than any accusation could. The racist man shrank further, unable to meet the child's eyes. He looked away, staring at the floor, as if the carpet could swallow him whole. The father placed a steady hand on his daughter's shoulder. "Because sometimes people mistake cruelty for strength," he said gently, "but they always learn the truth." The girl nodded, her small face serious, as though she understood more than her years should allow. The passenger groaned softly, pressing his palms to his temples. His arrogance, once towering, was now rubble around his feet. No apology could rebuild it. No excuse could erase what had been spoken, what had been recorded. The black man rose slowly from his seat. The movement sent a ripple through the cabin. Every eye followed him, every phone lifted higher. He stood tall, towering not in size but in stature. He looked down at the passenger, voice calm but commanding. You thought this seat was too small for her, but it turns out the world is too small for your ignorance. The words lingered, sharp, undeniable. The passenger shook his head violently, his voice cracking. Please, I didn't know. If I had known who you were. The man cut him off with a wave of his hand. That's the problem. Respect shouldn't depend on who someone is. It should exist because of who you are. The silence that followed was suffocating. No one moved. No one breathed too loud. It was the kind of silence that changed people, that carved lessons deep into their bones. The passenger slumped back into his seat, defeated beyond repair. His laughter, his sneers, his false confidence, all gone. What remained was only a shell of a man, crumbling under the weight of his own arrogance. The black man turned back to his wife and daughter. His expression softened. He sat down beside them, wrapping his arm gently around his family. He didn't need applause. He didn't need validation. His dignity was its own victory, but the cabin knew what they had witnessed. They had seen arrogance collapse. They had seen dignity rise, and they knew, long after the plane touched down, this story would travel far, carried by every phone, every whisper, every memory. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, steady and calm, announcing the descent. Yet inside the cabin, no one was calm. The air was heavy, the tension unbroken, as though every breath carried the memory of what had unfolded. The racist passenger sat hunched in his seat, arms wrapped around himself, as if trying to shield what little pride he had left. His earlier bravado, his mocking laughter, his loud arrogance, was now ash, scattered in the silence. He avoided every gaze, staring fixedly at the floor, but he couldn't escape the weight of dozens of eyes. Phones still lingered, their cameras lowered but not forgotten. The passengers didn't need to keep recording. The story was already etched into their minds. Some scrolled through their clips, shaking their heads in disbelief, whispering about how quickly arrogance had collapsed. The black man leaned back in his seat, his arm draped around his wife, his hand resting on his daughter's small one. He spoke little, but his silence carried weight. He had not shouted, he had not threatened, yet he had commanded the cabin with the simple force of truth. His wife leaned into him, her eyes still shimmering with quiet strength. "It's almost over," she whispered. "No," he replied softly, his gaze forward, his tone calm but resolute. "It's just beginning." The words struck like thunder, not in volume, but in clarity. She knew what he meant. Beyond this cabin, the truth would travel. The phones would speak. The dignity they held in the face of cruelty would echo far louder than the insult that began it all. The little girl stirred, looking up at her father with wide eyes. "Daddy, is he going to be in trouble?" she asked, her voice innocent but curious. Her father looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Not the kind of trouble you think. Sometimes the worst punishment isn't what others do to you. It's what you do to yourself." The girl frowned, as though turning the words in her small mind, then nodded slowly. She nestled closer to her mother, reassured not by punishment, but by the promise of dignity. The racist passenger finally lifted his head, his lips trembling, his voice barely audible. I didn't mean to. The black man turned his head slightly, his eyes sharp but steady. "You meant every word. What you didn't mean was to face the truth, and now you have to live with it." The words landed like a gavel, final and irreversible. The passenger's mouth opened, but no reply came. He looked away again, broken by the weight of judgment that required no court, no jury. The cabin itself had passed the verdict. The plane dipped lower, city lights glittering in the distance like stars scattered across the earth. The descent was smooth, yet inside, hearts pounded with the weight of what they had witnessed. As the wheels touched down, a subtle shudder passed through the aircraft. Some passengers clapped, a reflex of relief, but the sound quickly died, replaced by silence once more. This landing wasn't just about geography, it was about truth hitting the ground, undeniable and unshakable. The seatbelt sign chimed off. Passengers rose slowly, gathering their belongings, casting sidelong glances at the fallen man. No one spoke to him. No one offered comfort. Silence itself became his prison. The Black family stood, moving with grace. The father took his daughter's hand, guiding her gently into the aisle. The mother carried their bags, her shoulders squared, her head high. They walked with quiet strength, leaving behind the ruins of arrogance. As they passed the racist passenger, he shifted uncomfortably, his face pale, his lips trembling. He wanted to speak, to beg forgiveness, but his throat locked. The family didn't pause. They didn't need to. Dignity doesn't linger in the shadow of collapse. At the cabin door, the captain himself appeared, waiting. His eyes found the black man's, and in that moment, respect passed silently between them. He extended his hand. "Thank you," the captain said quietly, words carrying the weight of the entire flight. The man shook his hand once, firmly, but without pride. Truth doesn't need thanks. It just needs to be seen. With that, the family stepped into the jet bridge, their silhouettes framed against the light beyond. Behind them, the cabin emptied slowly. The racist passenger was among the last to rise. He shuffled forward, head low, avoiding every glance, every phone aimed his way. He moved like a ghost, no longer the loud voice that mocked, but a silent reminder of his own downfall. As he stepped out into the terminal, the hum of the airport swallowed him, but he could still feel the eyes of strangers burning into him. He knew this story would spread, beyond this flight, beyond this day, and he knew it would follow him. But the family walked into the crowd, their dignity intact, their silence louder than his laughter had ever been. The story had begun with arrogance, with mockery. It ended with truth, undeniable, unshakable, eternal. And in that truth, justice had landed.